All right. Welcome back to Gathering Folds. Today we're talking about square twists, both closed and open, and how you can practice these square twists on a grid. So, first off, I'm going to be using grids when I'm folding today. I've got a 8-fold square grid, another 8-fold square grid. And these two I'm using Taunt because that's paper that was already cut in 15 centimeter squares and it's convenient for me. This larger piece of paper is Skytone. I folded a 24-fold square grid. And check out my Odd Divisions blog for how to go about that process. I'll make sure to put a link in the description once the replay is up. So that's what I'll be using today. If you're watching the replay and want to follow along, feel free to pause and get those grids in place. So let's jump right into it. When we're talking about twists, what do we mean? When in origami tessellations, what we generally mean is a symmetric structure, rotationally symmetric structure. So we're not talking bilateral symmetry, we're talking symmetry around, that has pleats coming out of it that are all in that same rotational direction. And we can define that rotational direction as either right-handed. You can see I've got my right hand fingers curling around and thumb up in the middle, or left-handed, which is the opposite case. And so with the closed square twist, what we're going to focus on, since it's square, we're gonna have 4 pleats. And in the closed case, these pleats are gonna run straight through the middle. Now you might be saying, oh, I just saw you draw 2 lines, but you're saying 4. It's 4 if you consider them coming out from the intersection. Now, these mountain folds are not strictly the mountain folds that you'll see in the finished twist, but they are the folds that you need to guide your folding of the twist. So if I'm doing a right-handed twist on here, then my valley folds need to be one spacing around right-handedly as I go around my twist. And what I'm going to do to set this up is make sure my mountains are up, then swivel my mountains over the valleys. I want to make sure that you can see here the valley isn't quite coming on the grid line. I want to make sure it's all the way on the grid line, all the way over. And I make sure of that on all 4 of these pleats. And then I can push just outside of where the valley of one pleat meets the mountain of the next. And I can also push from the top and get my closed square twist. And here's another case where it's really nice to have a bone folder so you can get everything nice and smooth once you've put it in place. Now, I've been saying closed square twist a lot here. What does that even mean? So a closed square twist, when you look on the back, has all 4 of these pleats coming out of a single point. And so it's closed around that point. Also, our 4 mountain folds came in and effectively outlined a single point, and that'll be important as we go over to the open square twist. Now, this closed square twist I did was right-handed. So I'm going to do the open square twist left-handed for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to select some square. I can't select a square in the middle because there's a grid intersection in the middle of my 8-fold grid, but I can select this square. And if I'm working left-handedly, I can have my mountain coming out around the left-hand side, so kind of wrapping around left-handedly around my target grid square. And then the valley folds are going to come out one spacing even further out from that central grid square. So now I've got my setup of mountain and valley folds, and again, just like the closed square twist, this isn't precisely what we end up with. With the closed square, my starting mountain folds were coming into the center, but by the end, I had this diamond around the center. And this shape in the center is what I call the inner polygon of the twist. So when you're looking at a crease pattern, what you'll see in a twist is an inner polygon and then pleats coming off of each edge. So in the crease pattern, we wouldn't have these segments. We would just see this inner polygon. And as a fun fact, a closed square twist is rigidly foldable if you fold the center square in half, and then you can get the rest of the twist. Now, this isn't very useful when we're folding square twists into tessellations because we typically don't have those fold lines in place already. And if we're doing more than one square twist, well, then that has complicating factors on putting in the next one rigidly. But since we can fold this twist directly on the grid itself, we don't have to worry about any of that. So returning to our left-handed open square twist, again, I'm going to emphasize the mountains first. So I'm emphasizing, and I'm really focusing more on the part of the mountain that's outside of this central square, this target grid square. And you can see that I'm letting my valleys also come into place as I start twisting around here. And so I let all of these come into place. I set the paper flat on my flat surface, my desk. And this one, and with most open twists, you tend to squash more from the top than by pushing on the corners. So when I squash, again, really nice to have a bone folder at this point. I then have full control over my paper. I've maintained my valley folds on their appropriate grid lines. And since I did one of these twists right-handed and the other one left-handed, I can match them up. Now, this would not be the case if I had two left-handed or two right-handed twists, but because these two are opposite twist orientations, the pleat is going the same direction in between, and then they curl away from each other. So we've got a closed square twist, open square twist. Now, like I said earlier, we need to remember that we're outlining one grid square in the open square twist, because when we flip it over, that one grid square is exactly what's outlined in the back. Now, I find that super cool. It's something that I didn't realize that what you outline on the front is what you get on the back until I was in conversation with Ben Parker and others at the Math, Origami, and Beverages meetings to see that this is actually a mathematical truth, that what you outline on the front is what you get outlined on the back. So with these two twists, and you can see I can pair up any of these left-handed edges with the right-handed edge of the closed twist. Just some of them are aligning the edges of the paper. The next thing to look at is, okay, what's the crease pattern of this open square? And the crease pattern, like we saw with the closed square, does not include these mountains on the inside of the inner polygon. The crease pattern just includes the pleats and this inner polygon that I'm drawing. So it does not include these guidelines that are what we actually use to locate and fold the twist. And so that is a skill that you develop as you fold many tessellations, of recognizing, okay, if I have this crease pattern, then what is that telling me about what I need to locate in the paper to fold this without folding each and every line of the polygon that's not on grid lines individually before collapsing it together. So pluses of collapsing straight from the grid: obviously you don't have to do the pre-creasing that you would if you were putting in each of these lines by hand individually. It's more accurate. So if I am putting in each of these edges by hand, I'm going to have slight imperfections in the corners, and that could lead to puffiness in the twist in the larger pattern. Also, it's just a lot faster to be putting in the twists one by one instead of stopping to pre-crease everything first. So you get increased speed, increased accuracy by folding straight from the grid. So now I'm going to grab my 24 fold square grid, and this is a practice piece to demonstrate some principles that we can use in folding square twists in larger tessellations, and help us practice both the closed and the open square twist in left and right-handed orientations. So for me personally, I pretty much always choose to start a tessellation with a right-handed twist. This is mostly a personal convention, so I don't have to think about which direction the central twist is going to be. And so the first thing I'm going to do is find the center of my paper. I'm folding in half in one direction and then the other. And as I mentioned earlier with the open square twist, we can't put an open square twist exactly in the middle. So I'm going to choose to put a closed square twist in the middle this time. Now, one thing you'll notice when I open this paper back out is I've already got 3 of my 4 mountain folds for the closed square twist. So I can simply change that 4th fold from a valley to a mountain. And since I'm doing a right-handed twist, each of these mountains gets pushed up and over its respective valley. So here I've emphasized the mountains and valleys more at the edge than in the center, and then I'm going to work my way in closer. And as I do, I might have some puffiness here in the center, which is going to make my life a bit easier. I'm also going to check and make sure that the valleys are actually on grid lines. Once I'm sure that they are, I'll go ahead and squash my closed square twist. Now, one of the cool things about putting a closed square twist in the center of the paper is I don't have to keep track of the orientation of the paper. This orientation versus this orientation versus this one versus this one are all the same to me. Now, in my next step, I'm going to put in an open square twist, just like we did with these initial two. And that is going to have a orienting effect in what I fold after. But as far as which pleat to put it on, that's a completely arbitrary choice. So what I'm going to do here is put that next open twist at a spacing that I call a tube pleat. So if I put the next valley here and the next mountain one further, then if I close that pleat, if I fold that pleat, it creates this tube structure with the neighboring pleat from the closed square twist. And when I close that, I can start to see, oh, this kind of four-pointed star is kind of starting to form, and it's centered on this grid square right here. So I've got another mountain already in place on this edge. So that means I'm going to have a third mountain and associated valley down here, and the fourth will be on the right hand edge of the open square twist, or the target grid square rather. So when I'm pulling these things up, so one way to think about this is the closed square twist, the mountains go in on one grid line and continue out on the same grid line, both horizontal and vertical. On the open square twist, on the horizontal, the mountain comes in on one grid line and then shifts one to go out. Similarly, vertically, it comes in on one grid line, shifts one, and goes out. So if I have set my first two pleats, then I can say, okay, I'm going to need to shift my vertical mountain over one before it goes out. And I will also need to shift my horizontal mountain over one before it goes out. Now you might be saying, well, how do you know which direction to shift? You're going to shift your mountain away from the valley fold of the existing pleat. So my valley on this existing mountain is in here, so I shift the mountain away from the valley, and then the next valley goes on the far side. Likewise, vertically, I've got my valley, then my mountain. The next mountain shifts over away from the valley with a new valley on the far side. Once I've got this twist set up, I can go ahead and squash it, again, from the top. And what I'm going to do next is set up mirror symmetry lines that we can use to set up our next twists. So in this case, I'm going to simply draw a box around these two twists, like so. And this box is going to hold everything that's part of these two twists and nothing that is not. And I'm going to make these our mirror symmetry lines. So these symmetry lines are going to extend all the way across the pattern. And I'll take a moment to draw those on. So what this means is that anytime I cross a mirror symmetry line, I can look at the other side of the line to see what's going to go there. So one final line here. And as an example of this, let's take the open square twist. When I'm mirroring over this bottom line, I can see on the upper side of the mirror symmetry line, I have a valley fold one spacing out. So I can say, okay, I have a valley fold one spacing out, and then a mountain fold one further than that. And here again, we're in this really familiar situation where I have a new pleat intersecting an existing pleat, which defines my target grid square by the square that fits in on the inside, so away from the valleys of the two mountain folds coming together. So then I can set up my new pleat here. I'm choosing to set my next horizontal pleat next, and my new vertical pleat as well. Can make sure that all my valleys are on grid lines, and then squash my paper. So these two pleats from the two open squares have now formed a tube of their own. So these two open squares form a tube. Will the two closed squares also form a tube? Take a moment to think about that. And the answer is no. Because this pleat doesn't come exactly to the mirror symmetry line, there will be extra space. So we get kind of a broad tube, or a tube with two extra spaces, instead of a direct tube pleat like we did with the two open squares. So from here, we've got this structure that I call a pleat overlap. I had my first pleat coming down vertically, my second pleat came out horizontally. What we need to do is open up the paper so that the mountain folds of each of these pleats come straight in with no interruptions to a central point. With that in place, we can extend the mountain folds on either side, and then what I did just now might have looked a bit like magic. I was pulling together each of these grid intersections, these corners of grid squares, one diagonal spacing away from my intersection at the center of the closed square twist. And with those four corners all together, that meant that the valley folds of each of my four pleats were on grid lines and the twist could snap into place. So I'm going to go ahead and squash my closed square twist. And since we're going in this general direction, I'll continue on across this mirror line. One other thing at this point, I can go ahead and draw in another mirror symmetry line, since we have a new boundary between a cell of two square twists. And since my mirror symmetry line is only crossing pleats that are perpendicular to itself, I don't have to worry about whether I've got the right grid line when I'm crossing these pleats. And as you'll see in the upcoming weeks, that is a concern with triangle grids in general. Triangle grids and 45-degree grids. So then, with these four twists folded, you have folded a closed right-handed square twist, an open left-handed square twist, a open right-handed square twist, and a closed left-handed square twist. These 4 twists form a loop where you go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and back to the first. These loops of 4 twists are characteristic of tessellations that involve only square twists. You'll see them all over the place in every tessellation that uses only squares and many that don't. So one important thing to notice is since the loop is 4 twists instead of 3 or 5, we get to alternate right, left, back to right. So each pair has one right-handed and one left-handed twist. And that's very important when you're putting twists next to each other. So continuing around, I'm going to listen to my mirror symmetry line and put a closed square twist on the other side of the mirror symmetry line from my existing closed twist. This is going to mean putting the valley of my new vertical pleat one spacing from my mirror line and my mountain one spacing further. When I say one spacing further, what I'm referring to is the pleat depth. So this is another variable that can be changed once you are familiar with tessellations. And especially for advanced twists, you can have some different pleat depths in the same pattern and even in the same twist in special circumstances. So once I know my target grid intersection for making this closed square, I can bring up mountain folds on either side. And you can see I'm creating a new pleat overlap at the top. So once I have my mountain folds, I need to know which side of the mountains the valley is on. Well, I used my mirror symmetry line to figure out the valley for this bottom pleat. And then there's an existing valley on this right-hand side pleat. So I can follow the direction of those two to put my remaining pleats fully in place. And then I'm going to push just outside of where the valley connects with the mountain of the next pleat to open up and start squashing my closed square twist. So then continuing on up, I'm going to get another closed square at this new pleat overlap. And I know that because it's across this vertical mirror symmetry line from a closed square, and it's across a horizontal mirror symmetry line from another closed square. I would be really concerned if these two were different kinds of twists. So again, just like we did for the pleat overlap down here, I'm going to open up my paper, and this can be a bit of a tricky move to get used to, but don't worry, it gets easier with practice. And then I can grab the pleats of my new twist. Again, I'm using the relative position of the valley fold relative to the mountain fold of the two existing pleats to tell me the orientation of the remaining two pleats before I go ahead and squash my square twist. Now, if you're not familiar with square twists, you might feel that I'm going at a really accelerated rate through this. And that's because you'll have the recording to see later. So don't worry about keeping up exactly as I'm going, especially if this is your first time folding square twists. The rules will become more and more apparent as you go. And the emphasis with this piece is practice. So we're practicing both right and left-handed, closed and open square twists as we do this. So I'm going to continue spiraling around my central twist. I've got another mirror symmetry line, and so I know since this pleat is coming straight up to the mirror symmetry line, it's going to form a tube. So I've got my valley one spacing out and my mountain one further than that. That's going to give me the grid intersection where I will fold my next twist. And zooming in a bit, I can see that I'm going to have a closed square twist on both of these two vertical pleats. And they're both going to have this tube pleat relationship with the pleat below. They're just going to have opposite twist directions. So if I'm going to open up these two pleats, I may as well do both of these twists at the same time because it's easier to go ahead and do both than to do one and then really fight to get the paper back open for the next. And so what I'm emphasizing here is really the pointiness of the grid intersections that I want to put new twists on, so I can get all of these pleats down into place without losing the grid intersection that I wanted. And so here we've got two closed square twists that I can go ahead and squash one after the other. And out from here, I've got another open square twist. So you can see it's mirrored across from the open line. And so I already have two mountain folds intersecting with each other. And if I pull this slightly, you can start to see that characteristic four-pointed star shape is centered around this grid square right here. So then when I open this pleat overlap, this horizontal mountain needs to shift up one, and the vertical mountain needs to shift left one. With these new pleats in place, my open square falls in line. And with this twist, I can then add another of my mirror symmetry lines across the paper. So now I've folded what I call a ring around my central square twist, and we're at this position where we do not have any pleat overlaps. This is what I call a natural tiling break. So at natural tiling breaks, you will not have pleat overlaps. All of your pleats will go out to the edge of the paper without running into anything else. And so one of the main questions, if you're following my methodology of folding from the grid of, okay, you put in a twist, and then you resolve pleat overlaps if there are any. If there aren't, you put in another twist. And you just keep going through that loop of putting in twists, resolving pleat overlaps until you have completed as much of the tessellation as you want. In this case, I'm going to go all the way to the edges of the paper. And the trick to figure out here is, how do we know where to start the next twist? Well, one way to do it, like we saw here today, is to spiral. So I started from the center and worked out here and around, and I could just keep going around. That's a perfectly valid answer, and that's probably what I'm going to end up doing. Another way is to say, well, if I do, say, this tube pleat next, then I can get rid of 2 twists with one go and not need to worry about them anymore. I'm going to choose to do the next twist along the spiral, and it happens to be that it will cause a tube pleat across its respective mirror symmetry line. And on this ring around, I'll go a little bit faster than before. And so I can set up that next open square twist. And then I see, okay, there's pleat overlaps, I need to resolve them. So I can resolve those. And this time I've got 2 twists across a tube from each other, but they're open squares instead of closed. And so the mountain I'm going to take between them is going to be 1 spacing out than the mountain that stays put on either side. And so then I can squash them both and use my bone folder to get them nice and smooth. Then down below here, I'm just going to continue going around. I've got another situation where I need 2 open square twists across a tube from each other. And I can start right here in the corner, just emphasizing this tube going off to the right. And then I see I'm going to need 1 grid spacing in from the edge if you're using a 24-fold grid, another mountain, and then the mountain going off to the left is again going to be back up a grid spacing. So I can get these 2 in place. And with all of these where I'm doing 2 twists at once, you may not be comfortable with that your first time doing these twists. You may want to do each twist individually and then work your way up to doing 2 at a time later. So continuing with the next pleat overlaps, I've got a pair of closed square twists. So here the mountain coming through is going to go straight through and out the other side. And again, I do acknowledge that I am folding faster than a beginner would, but you either have, if you're watching the recording, or will have, if you're with me live, a pause button on this. So the next thing that I'm going to do here is recognize that my last mirror symmetry line was between the closed squares. This means that the next twist out needs to mirror what's on the other side of the closed square on the right. It's going to need to be an open square twist. So I'm going to turn my paper so it's easier to handle. Now my mirror symmetry line is horizontal, and I'm going to set up my 2 open square twists on either side of this tube pleat that was coming out of the two closed squares here and here, on screen here and here. And so in setting this up, I'm really close to the edge since I've used 24-fold paper, or grid rather. And I can set up both of these twists, and you can see these are mirror symmetric relative to each other. So then I'm going to continue on, again doing mirror symmetric open square twists all the way up this edge. Again, I have a tube pleat that I'm crossing, and so I can do both sides at once if I choose. Easier than squashing one and then having more constraints. So easier to already have this open than try and open it after folding this pleat. And if I really wanted to, especially if I had more grid, I could put another mirror symmetry line just outside of these open square twists, because remember, we're boxing in one closed and one open square twist. So then continuing back towards on this final edge, I'm going to have an open square and a closed square on the two sides of this tube pleat. My open square I'm going to set up first. So I already know the locations and orientations of all of these mountain and valley folds. And then set up the closed square in turn. And so you might be looking and seeing, wow, these four sides, none of them are the same. Why is that? Well, since we started our tessellation in the center of a square twist, instead of the center of mirror symmetry lines, we're going to get different expressions on the four edges of the tessellation, because we did not start in a center of symmetry. We started in a center of convenience instead. And this is partly to emphasize the fact that this tessellation that I'm folding is to practice the skill of folding closed and open square twists in both right and left-handed forms. We can make this as pretty as we want, with centering it in the center of symmetry. We can do all of that later, but first we need to know how to fold each of these twists. So this next tube, I've got a closed square transitioning to an open square. And in this one, the mountain comes across high and then exits the open square low. And again, you really want to make sure that your valley folds are actually on grid lines before you start to squash. And one note on squashing: the open square is more forgiving to squash than the closed square, because you can reach in from the back side and push out any corner that's misbehaving. The closed square, there's nowhere to push in to. And so you kind of got to get it from the front. Last but not least, we've got another open square. That's going to go right here in the corner. And so there we have it. We've got open square stripes and closed square stripes. So this one I call open closed stripes. And this is an excellent tessellation to practice left and right-handed open and closed square twists. And a lot of the other ways of arranging open and closed square twists, like one that I did a couple weeks back on reading crease patterns, where we were alternating the closed and the open square twist, you then would have all right-handed closed twists and all left-handed open twists. And so for today's session, I really wanted to emphasize both options and also teach a different pattern. So there's a lot of flexibility with square twists in general. And one thing you'll notice that I did today is take a block of 2 twists, put mirror lines around them, and make the whole tessellation. You can do that with any 2 square twists you want. I could have chosen to put the open square on the back of the paper. I could have chosen to space them further apart. I could have chosen any number of options. I could have the clusters, instead of being blocks of 2, be blocks of 4, and then mirror. In this case, since I already have mirror symmetry between these 4 twists, so in here, it's better described as blocks of 2. But if you had, for example, closed, open, then you could mirror that block of 4, and it would be well described as a block of 4. So I'm looking forward to seeing your adventures with closed and open square twists. Feel free to drop a comment down below, and I will see you next week to discuss closed and open triangle twists. So happy folding, and see you then.